It was a hard day, and by nightfall, something sweet was already calling your name. You told yourself you would not, and somewhere between the kitchen and the quiet, the wanting only grew louder, a soft, insistent pull toward sugar you could almost taste before you reached it. Here is the part that changes the story. Under real stress, the brain does not crave sugar because you are weak. It craves it because it is trying to keep you alive. Welcome to Psychology for Sleep. Tonight moves toward what stress actually does to a body that suddenly wants fuel, and why the pull you have blamed yourself for was never a verdict on your character. Let the day settle out of your hands. You're somewhere the wanting can simply be a signal, not a failure, nothing to resist, nothing to win, only a body doing what it was built to do. Let's follow that pull back to where it begins. You know the moment. The day tightens around you, and before you have decided anything, your body is already steering you towards something sweet. Researchers who study stress and appetite have found that this pull is not a lapse in character. It begins in the oldest, most protective circuits of your brain. Underneath everything we follow tonight sits one quiet question. Is the craving under stress a failure of willpower, or biology doing its job? For now, only notice how quickly the wanting arrives, and how little say you seem to have in it. That speed is not carelessness. That speed is a system that learned, long ago, to act before you could think. There is a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with an empty stomach. You feel it after a hard conversation, a missed deadline, a message you did not want to read, a sudden, specific reaching for sugar. Scientists distinguish this from true physical hunger and call it stress-driven eating, and it follows a different set of rules entirely. Physical hunger builds slowly and can be satisfied by almost any food. Stress hunger arrives suddenly, and it asks for something specific, something sweet, fast, and dense with energy. What you have felt as weakness is actually a signature. It is the fingerprint of a nervous system responding to threat, choosing fuel the way it always has. Before you can name what is wrong, your body often already knows. A tightening in the chest, a shallowness in the breath, a quiet alarm you cannot quite locate. Scientists call this the acute stress response, and it moves faster than conscious thought. Deep in the brain, a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala scans everything you sense for signs of danger, and when it finds one, real or imagined, it sounds an alarm before the thinking parts of your brain have caught up. This is why stress can feel like it hijacks you. In a sense, it does. The response was designed to protect you first and explain itself later. Perhaps you have noticed how a stressful moment makes your heart pound and your hands go cold, all within seconds. That first surge has a name. It is adrenaline, released by two small glands sitting just above your kidneys. When the amygdala sounds its alarm, a signal races to these adrenal glands, and they flood your bloodstream with adrenaline almost instantly. Your heart quickens, your senses sharpen, and blood is redirected toward the muscles that would carry you away from danger. This is the body preparing to move. And a body preparing to move, above all else, begins to think about one thing, where it will find the energy to do so. That racing, wired feeling you get in a crisis is only the first wave. Adrenaline fades within minutes, but stress rarely ends that quickly, so a second, slower system takes over. Scientists call it the HPA axis. It runs as a chain of signals, from the hypothalamus in your brain to the pituitary gland just below it, and down to the adrenal glands again. This chain is slower to start, but far more patient. Where adrenaline is a sprint, the HPA axis is built to endure. It is the part of you that keeps the alarm running long after the first fright has passed, and its main messenger is a hormone whose name you may already know, cortisol. You may have felt this without ever having a word for it, the way a difficult day leaves you not just tired, but strangely hungry hours later. That lingering pull is cortisol at work. Once the HPA axis activates, the adrenal glands release cortisol into your blood, and unlike the quick flash of adrenaline, cortisol stays. It rises within minutes and can remain elevated for hours. Its job is to keep your body ready for a challenge that has not ended, to hold the doors open, so to speak, in case the danger returns. And one of the ways it keeps you ready is by making sure fuel is close at hand. Cortisol, quietly, is a hunger hormone. Think of the times stress lasted not minutes but days, a hard week, a season of worry. In those stretches, the craving for sugar seems to grow rather than fade. Science offers a reason. Cortisol, the hormone that lingers through prolonged stress, actively increases appetite, and it shows a particular preference for foods that are sweet and energy-dense. Studies have found that people with higher cortisol responses tend to reach for more sugar and fat when under pressure. This is not indulgence. It is instruction. The hormone meant to carry you through a long threat is telling your body to stock up on the fastest fuel it can find. Consider what your brain was built to expect when it feels threatened. For nearly all of human history, stress meant something physical, a predator, a rival, a need to run or fight. Your brain still carries that ancient blueprint. When the alarm sounds, it assumes your muscles are about to demand enormous energy, and it prepares to supply it. The trouble is that today's stress is rarely physical. The email, the bill, the worry at midnight, none of it asks your body to sprint. Yet the ancient program runs anyway, flooding you with the drive to find fuel your muscles will never actually burn. Your biology is answering a question the modern world stopped asking. There is an organ inside you that never rests, never stores much of its own reserve, and never stops demanding to be fed. That organ is your brain. Though it makes up only about 2% of your body weight, it consumes roughly 20% of your energy, and it runs almost entirely on one fuel, glucose, the simplest form of sugar. Unlike muscle, the brain keeps almost no fuel in reserve. It depends on a steady supply arriving through the blood, moment to moment. This is why the brain guards its glucose so fiercely. When the supply feels threatened, it does not wait politely. It reaches for more. There is a familiar fog that arrives when you are stressed and running on empty, the short temper, the difficulty holding a thought. That is your brain protecting its fuel. Under stress, the brain's demand for glucose actually rises because vigilance is expensive. Staying alert, scanning for threat, holding your body in readiness, all of it burns energy. Researchers describe the brain as a selfish organ in these moments, prioritizing its own supply above the rest of the body. So the pull toward sugar under stress is not only a hormonal command. It is a hungry brain, working harder than usual, asking for exactly the fuel it knows how to use. Recall the feeling of being handed something sweet in a hard moment, a piece of chocolate, a warm drink, a small kindness that steadied you. There is a reason it works so well. Sugar is glucose in its most immediate form, and the body absorbs it with remarkable speed. Within minutes of eating something sweet, blood glucose begins to rise, and that fuel reaches the brain almost at once. To a system that feels under threat and starved of energy, this is not a treat. It reads as relief. The sweetness arriving on your tongue is, to your ancient biology, the fastest possible answer to a very old question: is there enough? Have you ever reached for something sweet and felt, even before eating it, a small loosening of the tension you were carrying? That is not imagination. The body begins to anticipate relief the moment fast fuel is on its way. Because sugar delivers energy so quickly and so reliably, the brain has learned to treat it as a kind of instant medicine, a dependable answer to the alarm of stress. This is why, under pressure, you rarely crave a plain, slow food. You crave the sweet, the fast, the certain. Your body is not being frivolous. It is reaching for the remedy it trusts most, the one that has never once failed to arrive when it was needed. There is a warmth that spreads through you after something sweet in the difficult moment, the sense that the edges of the world have softened just slightly. Scientists have traced part of this to how sugar quiets the stress response itself. Research suggests that consuming sweet or high-calorie foods can dampen activity in the HPA axis, the very system pumping out cortisol. In other words, sugar does not only feed the brain, it can turn down the volume on the alarm. This is a real, measurable effect. When your body reaches for sweetness under stress, it is reaching, in part, for a way to calm the storm. It is standing inside. Think of how a comforting food can feel less like eating and more like being held. That impression has a biological basis. Foods high in sugar and fat have been shown to blunt the body's cortisol response and soften the felt experience of stress, which is why they earned the name comfort foods in the first place. The comfort is not only in the memory or the ritual, though those matter. It is also chemical. The sweetness genuinely eases the stress response for a time. So when you turn to sugar in a hard hour, you are not failing to cope. You are using one of the oldest coping tools your body has ever known. Right now, as your breathing has begun to lengthen, something is already happening in you without any effort on your part. The hunger you feel under stress, the one we have been tracing, is not a signal of something broken. It is a signal of something ancient and protective, a body doing precisely what it learned to do across countless generations. The question we opened is starting to shift. Perhaps the craving was never a lapse to be ashamed of, but a message to be understood. You do not need to decide anything about it now. You only need to let the understanding settle where the guilt used to sit. The next stretch follows what happens when that fast relief arrives, and why it does not stay. You may carry, somewhere quiet, the belief that wanting sugar under stress is a personal failing, a lack of discipline you should have outgrown. Science tells a different story. The craving you feel is generated by hormones, brain chemistry, and survival circuits that operate almost entirely outside conscious control. Cortisol rises whether you approve of it or not. The brain's glucose demand climbs without asking permission. By the time the wanting reaches your awareness, the machinery has already been running for minutes. This matters because it changes what the craving means. It was never evidence of weakness. It was evidence that your body was doing its job, faithfully, the only way it knows. Consider how differently two people might respond to the same stressful day, one reaching for sweetness, another barely noticing hunger at all. Part of that difference is written into biology, not character. Studies show that people vary in how strongly their cortisol rises under stress, and those with larger cortisol responses tend to crave and eat more sugar and fat afterward. This variation is shaped by genetics, early life, sleep, and countless factors you did not choose. So if your cravings feel stronger than someone else's, it is not a sign that you care less or try less. It may simply mean your particular stress system speaks a little louder than theirs. Perhaps you have noticed that the days you sleep poorly are also the days sugar calls loudest. That connection is real, and it runs through the same stress machinery. Poor sleep raises cortisol and heightens the body's stress response, which in turn amplifies the pull towards sweet, energy-dense food. A tired body reads more of the day as threat, and a threatened body reaches for fuel. This is why willpower alone so often fails against a stress craving, because the craving is being fed by a state of the whole body, not by a simple choice in the moment. You are not fighting a want. You are standing inside a physiology. Think of a moment when you felt genuinely unsafe, a near accident, sudden bad news, and how your whole body seemed to reorganize itself in an instant. Underneath that reorganization is a single ancient priority: survive now, sort it out later. Every part of the stress response serves that priority, including the hunger. The body does not pause to weigh long-term health against immediate readiness. It cannot. In the logic of survival, fast energy now is always worth more than slow wisdom later. So when stress makes sugar feel urgent, it is because a very old part of you has classified the moment as one where the future can wait. It is trying, in its way, to keep you alive. There is a strange narrowing that stress brings, the way the wide, considered world shrinks down to what is right in front of you. That narrowing is not only emotional. Under stress, the brain shifts resources away from the slow, deliberate prefrontal cortex, the region that weighs consequences and holds long-term goals. With that region quieted, the pull of immediate reward grows stronger, and the voice of restraint grows fainter. This is why, in a stressful moment, the sensible plan you made this morning can feel so far away. It is not that you forgot it. It is that the part of you that holds such plans has temporarily stepped back to let a faster, older system lead. Recall a time you promised yourself you would resist, and then, under pressure, reached for the sweet thing anyway, and the small ache of self-blame that followed. Science suggests that ache is aimed at the wrong target. In the moment of acute stress, the biological drive toward fast fuel can overpower deliberate intention, not because your intention was weak, but because it was never a fair fight. One system is conscious, effortful, and slow. The other is automatic, ancient, and fast. Losing to it is not a moral failure. It is the predictable outcome of a nervous system built to prioritize survival over resolve. There is a quiet cruelty in how we speak to ourselves about food, a harshness we would never turn on a friend. Yet the craving that draws so much of that harshness is, at its root, an act of self-protection. Every hormone, every signal, every surge we have followed tonight exists because at some point in your evolutionary past, reaching for energy under threat kept your ancestors alive long enough to become you. The craving is inheritance, not defect. When you understand it this way, the guilt begins to lose its grip, not because the craving disappears, but because it no longer means what you thought it meant. Perhaps you have wondered why you cannot simply decide to stop wanting sugar when you are stressed, why understanding alone does not switch the craving off. The answer lies in how these systems are layered. The stress response and its hunger are governed by structures far older and faster than conscious will, structures that were regulating bodies long before anything like deliberate choice existed. Knowing why the craving happens does not disable the machinery that produces it. But it does something else, something quieter and more lasting. It changes your relationship to the craving, turning an enemy you fight into a signal you can finally hear without shame. Think of how much energy you may have spent not on the craving itself, but on the war against it, the resisting, the failing, the judging, the resolving to do better. That war has a cost of its own. The self-blame that follows a stress craving is, ironically, another form of stress. One more thread of threat for the body to respond to. And a body under more stress reaches again for the fastest fuel it knows. In this way, the guilt can quietly feed the very cycle it condemns. There is a gentler possibility beginning to appear that understanding, rather than punishment, might be the thing that finally loosens the pattern. You may sense, even now, that something is beginning to soften, the hard edge of an old story about yourself and food. The question we started with was whether the stress craving is a failure of willpower or a matter of biology. Fact by fact, the answer has been settling toward the body. The craving arises from hormones you did not summon, circuits you did not build, and instincts older than memory. It is biology first, and only afterward the story you tell about it. And if it is biology, then the guilt was never quite accurate. It was aimed at a self that was, all along, simply trying to survive. Consider, for a moment, everything your body did tonight the instant it felt stressed. It sounded an alarm, released its hormones, protected its brain, and reached for the one fuel it has always trusted, all before you had a chance to weigh in. What we have been circling is a single, steadying truth. The sugar craving under stress is not a verdict on your character. It is a message from a system built to keep you alive, speaking the only language it knows. But a message is not the same as a command, and understanding is not the same as helplessness. What the sweetness does once it arrives, how it lifts you, and why the lift does not last, is where the next part of the night begins. Something has quieted in you as we have moved through this. The tightness that a hard day leaves behind is loosening its hold, thought by thought. Take one slow breath and let the old blame go a little looser with it. You were never the problem here. We are moving through this gently, together, and there is nowhere else you need to be tonight. You've probably noticed that the moment you decide something sweet is coming, you already feel a little better before the first bite ever lands. Researchers who study reward found that much of the relief lives in the anticipation, driven by a messenger called dopamine. Dopamine is often called the pleasure chemical, but that is not quite what it does. It is the anticipation chemical, the signal that rises when your brain expects something good is on the way. When you reach for the cupboard, dopamine climbs during the reaching, not only during the tasting. The pull you felt was never greed. It was a brain leaning toward relief it had learned to trust. There is a reason sugar feels dependable in a way that few other comforts do, especially on days when nothing else seems steady. Scientists found that sweetness is one of the fastest, most reliable signals the reward system recognizes, almost from birth. Sweet taste lands on the tongue and reaches the brain's reward centers within seconds. Unlike most rewards, which are uncertain or delayed, sugar delivers its signal quickly and almost every time. Your nervous system learns patterns, and it prefers rewards that are quick and certain over ones that are slow and doubtful. Under stress, that reliability becomes precious. When the world feels unpredictable, the body simply moves toward the one comfort it knows will answer. Think of a moment when a small treat somehow settled a feeling that logic alone could not touch. What we now understand is that sugar's reward signal reaches emotional circuits, not only the parts of the brain that track hunger. The reward pathway winds through regions tied to mood and motivation, including the nucleus accumbens, a hub for the sense that something feels worth doing. When sweetness activates this hub, it does more than register taste. It briefly lifts the emotional tone of the whole system. This is why a cookie can feel like more than food during a hard hour. The comfort was real, because the relief was reaching the exact place the hard day had worn thin. You may have felt that under pressure the wanting seems to grow teeth, stronger and more insistent than it ever is on a calm afternoon. Researchers found that stress does not create the craving from nothing. It turns up the volume on the reward system you already have. When the body senses strain, it heightens motivation toward anything promising a quick payoff. The reward circuits that gently notice sweetness on an easy day begin responding far more strongly. Studies show that people under mild stress rate sweet foods as more appealing and reach for them faster. Nothing about you changed. It was never that your willpower shrank. It was that the pull grew quietly without asking your permission. Perhaps you have caught yourself reaching for something sweet, almost on autopilot, your hand moving before any decision. Science calls this the difference between wanting and liking, and stress widens the gap between them. Wanting and liking are handled by separate systems in the brain. Liking is the actual pleasure of the taste. Wanting is the urge to seek, and it can grow far larger than the pleasure it promises. Under stress, the wanting system becomes especially loud, which is why you can crave a food intensely and still feel only small satisfaction once you have it. So the craving that felt overwhelming was often louder than the comfort it delivered, a volume issue, not a character one. You might remember how, in a truly tense moment, a single square of chocolate felt like it carried more weight than it should. Researchers describe sugar under stress as almost a fast-acting medicine the brain reaches for on instinct. When the reward system is amplified and the mind searches for steadiness, sugar delivers a quick lift in mood and focus. For a short window, the sweetness quiets the internal noise of stress. The brain notices this relief and files it away as something that works, a pattern-seeking organ reaching for the fastest remedy. What looked like a lack of discipline was a body doing the oldest thing it knows, reaching for what reliably helps. Consider how the smell of something baking or a wrapper's crinkle can start the wanting before you've seen the food. Scientists found that the reward system learns cues, so that reminders of sugar can trigger craving on their own. Through a process called associative learning, the brain links sugar's reward to the sights, sounds, and settings that surround it. Over time, those cues alone can spark a dopamine rise and a pull toward sweetness. A certain hour, a certain chair, a certain mood, each can become a quiet signal. Under stress, these learned cues fire more easily. The pull that seemed to come from nowhere was memory doing its work, a body remembering where comfort once lived. There is a reason certain foods earn the name comfort foods, and it is not only about how they taste. What we now know is that comfort foods are built partly by learning, by the moments in which you first found relief in them. A comfort food is rarely comforting by taste alone. It becomes comforting because your brain has paired it, again and again, with soothing, safety, or care. The reward system stamps those pairings deep, so the food carries emotional meaning far beyond its sweetness. When stress arrives, the mind reaches for the foods it has learned mean relief. The food that steadies you carries a history, and that history is part of why it works. You may have noticed that the craving under stress feels less like hunger and more like a search for something to feel better. Researchers distinguish physical hunger from emotional reward seeking, and stress tilts you strongly toward the second. Physical hunger builds slowly and can be eased by almost any food. Emotional reward seeking is different. It is specific, sudden, and often points straight at sweetness. Under stress, the reward system takes the lead, and the body seeks a mood shift more than it seeks calories. This is why a full stomach can still crave dessert on a hard night. That craving was never a failure to be full. It was a quiet request for comfort, wearing hunger's clothing. Perhaps you have felt that on a stressful day, the usual small pleasures lose their pull, while sugar keeps its glow. Scientists found that stress narrows the reward system's attention, dimming subtler joys and brightening the fastest ones. When the body is strained, the reward system favors rewards that are immediate and intense over those that are gentle and slow. A walk, a conversation, a quiet hobby, these ask for time and offer a softer return. Sugar offers a sharp, quick signal that cuts through the noise. So stress not only strengthens the craving for sweetness, it quiets the alternatives. It was not that you stopped loving the gentler comforts, it was that stress turned down their light. You might recognize the way restraint feels heavier under pressure, as though holding back costs more than it usually does. Researchers found that stress does not only amplify wanting, it quietly weakens the brain's braking system at the same time. Self-restraint lives largely in the prefrontal cortex, the thoughtful region behind your forehead that weighs long-term choices. Under stress, this region receives fewer resources, while the faster reward and impulse circuits grow more active. So two things happen together. The pull toward sugar rises, and the part that would normally temper it grows tired. Resisting felt so hard because the very part meant to help you resist had quietly stepped back. For a while tonight, the question was whether the craving under stress was a failure of your willpower. Piece by piece, the answer has been leaning elsewhere. If the reward system grows louder while the restraining part grows quieter, then what felt like weakness begins to look like biology arranging itself, and the question shifts from why you keep giving in to what the body is actually reaching for. In a fragile mood, the anticipation of a sweet reward can feel like a small promise that things will be okay. Science calls this reward prediction, and under stress the brain leans on it harder than usual. The reward system is built to predict good outcomes and guide you toward them. When you expect sugar, the brain releases a wave of anticipation that feels, in itself, like relief. Under stress, with the mind searching for steadiness, this predicted reward carries extra emotional weight, and the promise of the treat becomes a kind of anchor. The relief you felt before the first bite was real, because hope, even small and sweet, is something the body knows how to make. You may have felt guilt arrive almost as fast as the craving, as if wanting the sugar were itself the problem. Researchers found that the wanting and the guilt come from different places, and only one of them is doing anything useful. The craving rises from ancient reward circuits doing their honest work, seeking relief in a hard hour. The guilt arrives later, from the thinking mind judging that reach against a story about discipline. But the reward system was never breaking a rule. It was following the design that kept your ancestors alive when quick energy meant survival. The craving was biology. The shame was a story added afterward, and only one of those was ever true. Perhaps you have wondered why the same craving that feels so powerful in the evening barely whispers in the calm of morning. Scientists found that reward-seeking rises and falls with your stress and your state, not with any fixed flaw in you. The pull toward sugar is not a constant trait. It moves with the conditions of your day. When stress is low and the mind is rested, the reward system stays quiet and restraint comes easily. When strain builds and the brakes tire, the same person feels the craving surge. Only the state of your nervous system changed. You were never two different people, only one body, moving through hours that asked different things of it. Once you understand the pull, it begins to feel less like an enemy and more like a message you can finally read. Researchers describe the craving as information, a signal about your state, not a sentence about your strength. When the reward system reaches for sugar under stress, it is reporting something true. The body is strained and seeking relief. Seen this way, the craving becomes honest feedback about how much the day has asked of you. It is not the voice of weakness, it is a gauge showing where your resources have run low. The craving was never accusing you of anything. It was only telling you plainly that you had been carrying a great deal. Something in you has softened over these last few minutes, the wanting a little quieter now that it has a name, the judgment a little farther away. There is nothing here to resist tonight, and nothing to prove. Let one slow breath move through you, and let it carry a small mercy for the version of you that only ever reached for relief. We keep drifting, gently, together. You may have noticed that stress does something strange to your body before you reach for food, a jittery, wired feeling, as if some hidden switch had been flipped. What you were feeling was your bloodstream filling with fuel. When cortisol rises, one of its first jobs is to raise the glucose in your blood, so your muscles and brain have quick energy for whatever the stress seems to demand. It does not stop to ask whether the threat is real. A deadline, a difficult message, a long day with no rest, the body treats them the way it once treated danger. The craving you feel later is downstream of a body already braced to run. Perhaps you have wondered where that sudden energy comes from when you have not eaten in hours. Your liver has acquired talent scientists call gluconeogenesis, the making of new glucose from scratch. Under the influence of cortisol, the liver breaks down stored material and assembles fresh sugar molecules, releasing them steadily into your blood. This is why stress can raise your blood sugar even when no food has passed your lips. Your body is not waiting for a meal. It is manufacturing fuel internally, preparing you for an emergency that, in modern life, is usually just a feeling. The pull towards something sweet is a body topping up a tank. It has already begun to fill on its own. There is a familiar restlessness in stress, a sense of being revved up with nowhere to go. Beneath it, your blood glucose is climbing, and your body notices. The pancreas responds by releasing insulin, the hormone whose job is to move that sugar out of the blood and into your cells. On an ordinary day, this is a graceful exchange, a slow rise and a gentle return. But cortisol changes the choreography. It keeps glucose high while insulin works to bring it down, so the two are pulling in opposite directions inside you. What you experience as agitation is, in part, two ancient systems trying to agree on how much fuel one quiet evening actually requires. You might recall a moment after a stressful stretch when the energy suddenly drained out of you, leaving you hollow and reaching for something to eat. That emptiness has a mechanism. When insulin finally clears the surge of stress-driven glucose from your blood, it can overshoot, pulling sugar levels lower than where they started. This is the crash, a dip that your brain reads as a shortage. The same organ that runs almost entirely on glucose now senses less of it than it would like, and it begins, gently but insistently, to ask for more. The craving that arrives is not greed. It is a brain noticing a drop in its only reliable fuel and doing the sensible thing. There is a particular kind of hunger that appears after stress has already passed, a delayed, almost puzzling wanting. Researchers describe this as reactive craving, the rebound that follows a blood sugar crash. When glucose falls below the level your brain prefers, it does not send a polite request. It sends an insistent one, and it aims that request at the fastest possible fuel, sugar. This is why the pull after a hard day so often points towards something sweet rather than something slow. Your body is not asking for nourishment in general. It is asking for the quickest correction to a dip it did not choose, a brain solving a math problem in the only currency it trusts. If you have ever felt that stress makes you hungrier than the day should warrant, science now knows why, and it begins with a hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is the signal that tells your brain it is time to eat, and under sustained stress, its levels rise. Cortisol appears to lift ghrelin, turning up the volume on hunger, even when your body has energy to spare. This is not weakness dressed up as appetite. It is a chemical message, released without your permission, telling a very old part of your brain that fuel would be wise right now. The wanting you notice is a voice with a name, and it is speaking on behalf of a body trying to prepare. You may know the strange experience of eating and still feeling somehow unsatisfied, as if the signal to stop never quite arrived. Under stress, that signal is genuinely muffled. Leptin is the hormone that tells your brain you have had enough, that the tank is full and the wanting can rest. But chronic stress appears to blunt how well your brain hears leptin's message, a kind of resistance that leaves the fullness signal fainter than it should be. So hunger speaks loudly through ghrelin, while satisfaction whispers through a leptin your brain struggles to hear. The imbalance is not in your willpower. It is in a conversation between two hormones that stress has quietly tilted out of balance. Perhaps you have felt that stress does not simply make you want food, it makes you want it now, with an urgency that ordinary hunger lacks. That urgency is the two hormone systems working together against you and for you at once. Ghrelin is amplified, raising the drive to eat, while leptin is dampened, weakening the drive to stop. The result is a widened gap between wanting and enough, a gap that sugar is uniquely suited to fill fast. Your body has not malfunctioned. It has done exactly what stress asks, heightened the search for fuel and softened the sense of having found it. Between those two shifts lives the craving you have spent so long blaming on yourself. And here the question we started with begins to change its shape. We began by asking whether the sugar craving under stress is a failure of willpower or a matter of biology. What the body keeps showing, layer by layer, is that these were never two separate things competing inside you. The wanting is not sitting beside your biology, arguing with it. The wanting is your biology. Cortisol, glucose, insulin, ghrelin, leptin, arriving as a feeling you can taste. The second half of tonight follows that feeling further in, to where the story stops being about resisting and starts being about understanding. You just heard how stress can raise the wanting and quiet the signal that says you have had enough. Two systems pulled apart inside one body. And something in you may already recognize that gap, the way a craving can feel larger than the hunger beneath it. Notice right now wherever that familiar tension lives, the jaw, the chest, the restless hands. You do not have to solve it tonight. You only have to let it be a signal, the way the body meant it, rather than a verdict you keep handing yourself. The rest of tonight leans further into that gentleness, following the craving down to where the blame finally lets go. You might have blamed yourself for how quickly a craving can escalate under pressure, how a small wanting becomes something that seems to take over. There is a spiral beneath it, and it moves in a circle. Stress raises cortisol. Cortisol drives up blood sugar, and then the crash that follows. The crash sends the brain hunting for fast fuel. The sugar arrives, soothes briefly, and the cycle resets when the next stress lands. Each turn of the wheel feels like a personal defeat, but it is a loop. The body runs almost mechanically. Understanding the shape of the spiral changes what the wanting means. a pattern to see clearly, not a flaw to punish. Perhaps the hardest part has been the feeling that your body turned against you, choosing sugar over your own wishes, again and again. Yet everything stress does to your metabolism, the rising glucose, the insulin overshoot, the crash, the amplified hunger, the muffled fullness, points the same direction. Your body was not betraying you. It was trying, with an old and imperfect toolkit, to keep you fueled through what it read as hardship. The sugar craving is the visible edge of an invisible effort on your behalf. When you feel it next, you are not meeting a weakness. You are meeting a body quietly working to carry you, doing the one thing it has always known how to do. You may have noticed that reaching for something sweet feels less like a choice each time and more like a groove your hand already knows. Researchers who study repeated behavior call this the start of a learned loop, where the brain stops deliberating and runs a pattern it has practiced. The first time stress met sugar, your brain logged the relief as a solution worth remembering. By the 100th time, that logging becomes automatic. The circuitry that once weighed the decision quietly steps aside, and an older, faster system takes over. The path felt worn because it was, walked so many times that walking it stopped feeling like a decision. There is a moment, right before you reach, when the craving is not really about hunger. It is about wanting the feeling to stop. Scientists call this negative reinforcement, one of the strongest ways any behavior becomes locked in place. Reward is not only about gaining something pleasant, it is also about escaping something unpleasant. Under stress, sugar ends the discomfort quickly, so the brain files it not as a treat, but as relief. Each repetition strengthens the link between the uneasy feeling and the reaching. You are never chasing sweetness so much as chasing the quiet that came after it. If the reaching has started to feel like it belongs to a certain hour or a certain chair or a wave of tiredness, you have felt something real. Behavioral researchers call these cues the hidden triggers that start a habit before the craving reaches your awareness. A habit has three parts: a cue, a routine, and a reward. The cue is the signal, a time, a feeling, a place. Over time, the cue alone becomes enough to set the sequence moving. You do not decide to crave, the cue decides for you. It was never that you were weak at a certain hour. That hour had simply learned to ask. You might sense that the more tired you are, the louder the wanting gets, as if exhaustion itself had an appetite. Sleep researchers have found this is not imagination. Short sleep changes the chemistry that governs how hungry you feel. Two hormones sit at the center. Ghrelin signals hunger, leptin signals fullness. When sleep is cut short, ghrelin tends to rise and leptin to fall, tilting the whole system toward wanting more, and especially toward sweet, quick energy foods. The hunger after a short night was your body asking, the only way it could, for energy it did not get in sleep. Perhaps you have woken from a poor night, already braced for a day of reaching, as though the craving was set the moment you opened your eyes. What we now understand is that a single short night can shape the next day's appetite before you have made a choice. The brain regions that weigh long-term goals against immediate rewards do not work as well when underslept. Meanwhile, the regions that respond to tempting food grow more reactive. Poor sleep dims the path that plans and brightens the path that wants. You are not losing the argument with yourself. You are having it with fewer resources than the day asked. And here something quietly turns if the craving is set by a short night, a worn cue, a hormone shift you never chose. Then the question of whether this is a failure of will begins to loosen. The evidence keeps pointing the same direction, and it is not toward blame. Cortisol reaching for fast fuel, dopamine marking sugar as relief, sleep loss raising the volume of hunger, each describes a system responding sensibly to conditions it was handed. These are not choices in the ordinary sense. The wanting was never proof of something broken in you. It was proof of a system doing precisely what it was built to do. You may have felt the guilt arrive faster than the sugar even settled, a second wave sharper than the first. Psychologists studying eating and emotion have found that this guilt does not close the loop, it feeds it. Guilt is itself a stressor. When you reach for sugar under strain, then criticize yourself. The criticism raises the very stress the sugar was meant to soothe. Cortisol rises again, the fast fuel signal returns, and the next reaching is the same loop tightened by shame. The judgment you turned on yourself was not the cure for the craving. It was, without your knowing, one of its ingredients. There is a kind of eating that has nothing to do with the stomach, a reaching that begins in the chest, somewhere harder to name. Researchers call this emotional eating and understand it as a form of self-soothing rather than a lapse in discipline. When feelings grow large and there is no clear way to hold them, the body looks for something that can. Sweet, familiar food offers a brief comfort that asks nothing and comes at once. It is coping, using the tool closest at hand. What looked like giving in was often just a tender attempt to be comforted by something that never once let you down. You might have noticed that the comfort does not last, the softness fades, and the reaching returns, sometimes within the same evening. Scientists describe this as the short half-life of sugar's relief, and it is part of what makes the loop repeat. The comfort is real, but brief. Blood sugar rises, mood lifts, then both come down, often below where they started. As the relief fades, the original stress remains, now joined by a dip in energy. The conditions that produced the first reaching return. The reaching came back not because you lacked resolve, but because the relief was built to be brief, the ache beneath it to remain. If you've ever promised yourself, sincerely, that tonight would be different, and then watched the reaching happen anyway, you know a particular quiet defeat. Psychologists studying self-control have found that willpower is not a fixed trait you have or lack. It is a resource that responds to conditions. The intention was real. What weakened was not your character, but the circumstances it had to survive. Under high stress, poor sleep, and a well-worn cue, the deck is stacked before the moment even arrives. The promise you broke was never broken by weakness. It was outnumbered by the conditions it had to keep in. You may have sensed that willpower fails most reliably at exactly the moments you most needed it, late, tired, stretched thin. Researchers have found this is not coincidence. The same states that raise cravings also lower the brain's capacity to resist them. Self-control leans heavily on the prefrontal cortex, the deliberate, planning part of the brain. That region is metabolically expensive and easily strained. When you are stressed or underslept, it has less to give, while the reward system grows more insistent. It was not that you tried harder on the good days, it was that the good days gave you more to try with. Perhaps you have wondered why simply knowing better has not been enough, why understanding the trap has not freed you from walking into it. Scientists who study habits have found that knowledge and habit live in different parts of the brain, and one does not easily overrule the other. Understanding is stored in the deliberate, conscious mind. Habit is stored deeper, in circuits built for speed that run without consulting your reasoning. When a cue fires, the habit acts before the knowing part of you has finished a sentence. You were never failing to understand. You understood perfectly, just after the older, faster part of you had begun to move. You might picture stress as a single storm that passes, but you may also have lived the other kind, the low, steady pressure that never quite lifts. Researchers distinguish this as chronic stress, and its effect on the body's chemistry differs from a brief scare. A short burst of stress raises cortisol and then lets it fall. Chronic stress keeps cortisol elevated for long stretches, and the body adapts to that level as if it were normal, keeping the pull toward fast, dense energy switched on. The wanting that never fully left was the sound of an emergency system that was never given the signal it was safe to rest. And so the question turns again. You began wondering whether the craving was a flaw in you, and now it looks more like a signal from a body kept too long on alert. The pattern across all of this is consistent and points away from blame. Chronic cortisol does more than raise cravings. Over time, it shapes how the body holds on to what it takes in. That is not a verdict about your appetite. It is a mark of how long the alarm has been left running. What you carried was not evidence of failure. It was a record, written in your chemistry, of how long you had braced. You may have felt your body hold on to a hard season in ways that resisted every effort, as though listening to something other than what you ate. Researchers have found it may well be stress chemistry can keep the whole system braced long after the day is done. Prolonged stress hormones tell the body again and again that hardship may still be coming. Under that message, it clings to its resources rather than letting go, not from malfunction, but from an old caution it was never told to lower. The body was not betraying you, it was following instructions no one had ever told it to stop giving. Perhaps you have watched a hard week bleed into your sleep, and the poor sleep bleed into the next day's reaching, until you could not tell where one began. Scientists describe this as a bidirectional loop, where stress, sleep, and craving each feed the others. Stress makes sleep harder to reach and shallower once reached. Short sleep raises the next day's cravings and lowers the capacity to resist them. The reaching offers brief relief, but leaves the stress intact, which carries into the next night. You were not failing at three separate things. You were caught in one moving system that had learned to keep itself in motion. You might notice that the loop has a way of narrowing your sense of yourself until the reaching starts to feel like a verdict on who you are. Psychologists have found that this narrowing is itself part of how the cycle sustains. Identity becomes fuel. When a behavior repeats, the mind looks for an explanation, and the easiest is often a story about character. I have no discipline. But that story raises stress and lowers the sense that change is possible, feeding the very loop it claims to describe. You were never the person the loop kept insisting you were, only someone inside a system that spoke in your voice. If the loop has ever seemed to have a life of its own, running whether you were paying attention or not, you have felt one of its truest qualities. Researchers describe well-worn habits as increasingly automatic, needing less conscious input to keep running. As a habit repeats, the brain requires less deliberate involvement to carry it out. The behavior becomes efficient, how you tie a shoe without thought. But the same efficiency applies here. The more the loop runs, the more it runs on its own. The loop felt automatic because it was, smoothed by repetition into something that no longer waited for your permission to begin. You may have caught yourself already reaching before any decision seemed to happen, the hand ahead of the thought. Scientists studying action have found that in deeply practiced behaviors, the movement can begin before conscious intention catches up. In an automatic habit, the cue triggers the routine through fast circuits below awareness. The sense of deciding often arrives afterward, narrating a choice the older systems had already set in motion. This moves the reaching out of moral choice and into learned mechanism. You were not choosing badly in that moment. You were watching a choice made long before by a version of you trying to help. There is a weariness that comes not from the craving itself, but from the long argument with it, the same battle repeating. Researchers who study behavior change have found that fighting a loop head-on, with force alone, is among the least reliable ways to undo it. Direct suppression asks the deliberate mind to override the automatic one indefinitely, but the deliberate mind tires and the automatic one does not. This is why willpower alone so often collapses, asking the wrong system to do the work. The exhaustion was not a sign you fought too little. It was a sign you fought in the one way that could never hold. You might have wondered whether wanting the sugar is separate from liking it, whether the pull and the pleasure are even the same thing anymore. Neuroscientists have found that they are not. The brain runs wanting and liking on partly separate systems. Over many repetitions, the reward system can grow to want something more strongly than it actually enjoys it. The craving becomes loud and insistent, while the pleasure quietly fades. A deeply grooved habit can feel urgent yet strangely hollow. What kept calling you was not the pleasure you remembered. It was a wanting that had learned to outlast the very thing it wanted. And here the answer draws closer. If wanting can outlive liking, if the loop runs without permission, if the body braces long after the danger passes, then none of this was ever a weak character. The whole pattern, seen together, resolves toward a single recognition. The learned cue, the negative reinforcement, the sleep-driven hunger, the automated routine, the split between wanting and liking, every mechanism describes a system, not a self. Each part responds logically to what came before it. The question you carried in, was this weakness, is quietly answering itself. It was never weakness, it was a loop, and loops are things that can be understood. You may feel, right about now, a loosening of something you have held tightly, the belief that this was all your fault. Researchers who study self-compassion have found that this loosening is not indulgence, it is a condition under which change becomes possible. When the loop is understood as biology rather than character, the shame that fed it has less to hold on to. With less shame comes less of the secondary stress that kept refilling the cycle. It removes one of the loop's quiet engines. What you are setting down was never yours to carry. A story about weakness, where there was only a system doing its work. Perhaps you can sense, beneath the loop's noise, that a body running this pattern is not broken. It is a working one, doing its best with what it was given. Scientists describe the whole stress and sugar system as adaptive, built to help you survive, not to fail you. Every piece of the loop began as protection. The reach for fast fuel under stress kept ancestors alive through scarcity. Habits automation freed the mind for other tasks. In the modern world, these designs misfire, but the machinery is sound. The body you blamed was never working against you. It was working still for a survival it never knew was over. And so gently, everything this stretch carried arrives at one clear place. Here is what the night has been assembling, piece by piece. The craving for sugar under stress is not a failure of willpower. It is a self-reinforcing biological loop. Cortisol reaches for fast energy, dopamine marks sugar as relief, and sleep loss raises hunger while habit runs the routine before thought arrives. Each part feeds the next, built by biology, not by character. And the loop, unlike a flaw, can be seen and gently worked with. What you feared was weakness, turns out to be biology. And biology, unlike shame, was never yours to be ashamed of. A loop, once you can see it whole, stops running quite so fast. Right now, in the quiet you have settled into, The stress that fed all of this is doing what stress does. When nothing is asking anything of it, it is beginning on its own to fall. You are not making it fall. You have simply stopped adding to it. And in that lowering, the loop loses a little of the fuel it needed to keep turning. Something has come clear tonight, that you were never the flaw in the machine. You were the one it kept trying, in its old and faithful way, to protect. The rest of what remains does not need to be worked out. It only needs to be received, the way the body receives sleep, without effort, without earning, without a single thing left to prove. What we have been circling all this while is nearly in reach. There is a kindness you have offered 100 times to other people and rarely once to yourself. When a tired friend reaches for something sweet at the end of a long day, you do not call it a failure. You understand it. Researchers who study self-compassion find that the same understanding, turned inward, quietly lowers the stress response itself. The gentleness is not a reward for good behavior. It is part of how the body finally stands down. There is one thing shame, for all its noise, has never once managed to do: make the craving smaller. The harsher the voice in your head, the louder the wanting seemed to grow. Research keeps showing that self-blame is read by the body as one more threat, another stressor on the pile. And a body under threat, as this night has traced, reaches for fast fuel. So of everything the day asked you to hold, the shame may be the very last thing worth setting down. Think of the last time you skipped a meal to be good, and how the evening turned into a search for something sweet. That is not weakness arriving late. That is a body running low on steady fuel, doing what it was built to do. When blood sugar dips and stress is already high, the pull toward quick energy becomes almost impossible to reason with. When the body is fed a little sooner, the craving often loses some of its urgency, because there was less alarm left to answer. Somewhere along the way, you may have learned that the answer to wanting is to want less, to restrict harder, to draw a firmer line. Yet studies of restriction find the opposite pattern. The tighter the rule, the sharper the rebound, the more the forbidden thing occupies the mind. The body does not respond to prohibition the way we hope. It responds to safety. And safety, it turns out, is what quiets the reaching far more reliably than any rule ever did. You already know the difference between a night you slept well and a night you did not. After the short night, everything felt harder and the sweet things called louder. This is not a lack of discipline. When sleep is cut short, the hormones that signal fullness fall, and the ones that signal hunger rise, and the craving for quick energy climbs with them. Rest is not separate from all of this. It is one of the quietest ways the wanting softens on its own. There is a breath you take without thinking, when something finally goes right, slow, low, and full. That breath is not just relief. Slowing the exhale gently signals the body that the threat has passed, and the stress response, the same one that reached for sugar, begins to ease. You do not have to breathe perfectly. You only have to breathe a little slower than the day asked of you. The body reads the message and starts, quietly, to unclench. You have felt the difference between eating something sweet while braced and tense, and eating it while calm and unhurried. The same food lands differently in a settled body. When the stress response is high, sugar arrives as emergency fuel, and the wanting spikes again soon after. In a calmer body, the same sweetness is simply a small pleasure, taken and then let go. The craving was never only about the sugar. It was about the state you were in when you reached for it. Consider how often the wanting arrived, not with hunger, but with a feeling you did not want to feel. Loneliness, dread, the ache at the end of a day that took too much. Science has a plain name for this. Sugar briefly quiets the stress signal and offers a moment of comfort. There is no shame in having found comfort where it was available. Naming what the craving was truly reaching for is the beginning of offering yourself the comfort more directly. You may have spent years treating the craving as an enemy to defeat, but something shifts when you meet it as a messenger instead. The pull toward sugar under stress is information. It says the body feels unsafe, underfueled, or worn thin. Listened to rather than fought, it points toward what you actually need: rest, food, steadiness, or simple kindness. The craving was never the problem. It was a signal you had been taught to silence instead of hear. There is a particular relief that comes the moment you stop arguing with yourself. You know it, the quiet that arrives when the inner debate finally goes silent. That silence is not defeat. When the mind stops treating a craving as a battle, the stress response has nothing left to feed on, and the wanting often loosens on its own. You do not have to win against yourself tonight. You only have to set down the fight you have been having for far too long. You have probably noticed that the days you were gentle with yourself were also the steadier days. That is not a coincidence dressed as a feeling. Kindness lowers the very stress, chemistry that drives the reaching for fast fuel, which means self-compassion is not the soft option, it is the effective one. The path out of the stress and sugar spiral was never harsher control. It was the warmth you kept saving for everyone but yourself. Think of how a small, steady meal, some protein, some fiber, holds you through an afternoon that would otherwise unravel. That steadiness is not willpower doing quiet work in the background. It is stable blood sugar, keeping the body out of the emergency state that reaches for sweetness. Calm was never something you had to earn by suffering first. Sometimes the whole craving quiets simply because the body was finally, unremarkably, fed enough to feel safe. You may have believed for a long time that wanting sugar under pressure said something about who you are. It never did. The pull is written into a nervous system that learned, long before you were born, to reach for fast energy when the world turned hard. Roughly the same response lives in nearly every stressed body that has ever been studied. What you called a flaw in your character was only ever the oldest survival wiring, doing its faithful work. There is a softening that happens when you finally stop keeping score of every craving. No tally of good days and bad, no ledger of failures. The research on lasting change is clear on this. The people who let go of the scorekeeping are the ones the stress-eating spiral loosens its grip on. The counting was another quiet stressor all along. Tonight, you can lay the ledger down. There is nothing left in it worth carrying into sleep. You know the difference between a decision made from fear and one made from calm. Fear reaches, grabs, and regrets. Calm simply chooses and lets the moment pass. When the stress response is quieted by rest, by breath, by kindness, the reach for sugar stops feeling like a compulsion and starts feeling like a choice you are free to make or not. The freedom was never in fighting the craving harder. It was in no longer being afraid of it. Perhaps you have felt on a gentler night that the wanting simply visited and left without a struggle. That is what the craving looks like in a body that feels safe. It rises, it is noticed, and it passes, the way most feelings do when they are not braced against. You do not have to make it leave. You only have to let it be there without turning it into a verdict. Even the strongest pull loses its grip when nothing is holding on to it. There is an old tenderness in feeding yourself well, the same one you would offer a child who had a hard day. Not as a reward, not as a rule, simply as care. Studies of eating and stress keep returning to this quiet truth. The body regulates best when it is met with steadiness and warmth, not vigilance. The kindest thing you can do for the craving is often the plainest, to make sure the body underneath it has been gently, adequately cared for. You may notice, if you listen tonight, that the wanting is quieter than it was this morning, not because you conquered it, but because the day is finally releasing its grip on your body. As the stress hormones ebb toward their natural nighttime low, the pull toward fast fuel eases with them without any effort from you. The craving was always tied to the state of the body. And the body right now is already beginning to let the long day go. There is a version of you that has been waiting a long while to be forgiven for something that was never a crime. The reaching, the wanting, the nights you gave in, none of it was the failure you were told it was. It was biology, faithful and old, trying to carry you through. You can offer that version of yourself the understanding now. Not tomorrow, once you have earned it. Tonight, exactly as you are, simply because it was always true. You have spent enough days at war with your own wanting. Notice in this quiet how little the war ever gave you. The craving did not shrink under judgment, it only hid and returned. What loosens it is the thing that felt too simple to trust: safety, warmth, rest, and a body no longer treated as an opponent. The peace you were reaching for through sugar was, underneath everything, a peace you can begin to offer yourself directly. Perhaps you can feel it now, the way the reaching softens when nothing is chasing it. This is the shape of the answer the whole night has been moving toward. The pull under stress was never a measure of your strength or your weakness. It was a body doing the only thing it knew, asking to be kept safe. And a body that feels safe, warm, and fed does not need to grab at anything. It can simply rest. There is a quiet that settles when you stop needing to be different than you are. No craving to defeat, no self to fix, only a tired body being allowed to be tired. In that quiet, the wanting has almost nowhere to stand. It was always loudest in the tension, and the tension is leaving you now. You do not have to do anything with this. You only have to let it be true, that you were never broken, only human. You may feel, beneath the day, a kind of relief you did not expect, the relief of no longer being to blame. The sweetness you reached for was never proof of a weak will. It was a body, wired for survival, doing what bodies have always done under strain. That understanding does not ask anything of you tonight. It simply sets something down that you have carried far too long. The quiet, exhausting belief that the craving meant something was wrong with you. There is a softness in knowing that nothing needs solving before you sleep. The craving will pass, as it always does. The stress of the day is already loosening its hold. And the body that reached and wanted and tried its best is the same body that will carry you gently into rest tonight. You do not have to have won anything. You only have to let the wanting be one more part of a long day, finally allowed to grow quiet. The craving was never a failure of who you are. It was your body loving you the only way it knew how. Reaching for safety, reaching for fuel, reaching for a moment of ease in a hard hour. There is nothing to forgive, because there was never any crime. Tonight, you can lay down the shame you were never meant to carry and let a kinder truth hold you instead. You were doing your best, in a body doing its best, and that was always quietly enough. The wanting that pulled at you all day has almost nowhere left to stand. The thing you called weakness turns out to be the oldest care a body knows, a reaching for safety, never once a flaw in you. There was never anything to forgive. Let your entire being dissolve into the warm, unhurried quiet a body finds when it finally believes it is safe. Whatever you reached for today, you can stop reaching now. Nothing is chasing you here. The reaching was only ever a body trying to keep you safe. It reached the way anything reaches, when the ground feels unsteady, quickly, without asking, doing the oldest work it knows how to do. And you answered it night after night, and then you blamed yourself for answering. But there was never a crime here. There was only a tired body and a mind that had learned to call its survival a failure. Tonight something can be set down, not the wanting that comes and goes on its own. What you can set down is the belief that the wanting meant something was wrong with you. You leave this hour knowing what the sweetness was really for, and knowing it, you no longer have to fight it or hide it or carry the quiet weight of being ashamed of a body that was only, all along, trying to hold you through. The Psychology for Sleep playlist has been returning to this same tenderness from many directions, the quiet places where the body does something we mistook for weakness. The next hour follows what happens when the reaching stops, and the calm you kept trying to reach for is finally the state you rest inside. That hour is waiting whenever you are ready. You can allow the wanting to settle now, the way a body loosens its grip once it finally believes the danger has passed. Let your shoulders grow heavy with the relief of no longer being to blame. If sleep comes, let it take you to the warm, unhurried place a body finds when it knows, at last, that it is safe. If your eyes have already closed, there is nothing left here to open them for. Rest well, gentle one. The reaching was never a failure. It was only your body loving you the only way it knew how. Where the science of the body becomes the softest place to forgive yourself and rest. Good night.